Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to the New Books in Asian Studies webinar with Benno Weiner. Today's event will be recorded and is also on the record. As a reminder, there will be a giveaway involved with this, which will include Benno's book. The Seeger Center continues to support local bookstores and authors through this series. To be eligible to win a copy of the book, you do need to follow the GWU Seeger Center on Twitter within the next hour and have a U.S. address to ship to. And so you go to Twitter and you type out GWU Seeger, that's SIGUR Center. You should be able to find their Twitter account and follow it and be eligible for the prize. We have today Benno Weiner is our primary guest to talk about his book. And Benno is at Carnegie Mellon University. Today also we have Tashi Rabgey of our co-sponsor Tibet GovLab, and myself, Sean Roberts, director of the International Development Studies program at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. I think we're going to jump right into this so that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. And we're going to start with a presentation by the author himself.
Well, thank you. First off, I want to send my sincere, thanks to everyone that helped make this talk possible. Benjamin Hopkins invited me a while back to speak at George Washington, and really, given all that's gone on in the world since then, I'm really thankful to him and to Helen Jia, who did a tremendous amount of work pulling this together. Everyone else at the Seeger Center and the Tibet Governance Lab for really staying the course over many months to host this event, which of course now is remote. And I'm really, really happy and humbled to have Tashi Rabgey and Sean Roberts here with me as well, both of whom I really admire for the really important work that they've done in their fields. And really to thank all of you. It's a bit weird not being able to see your faces, but I do appreciate people taking the time out of their days to listen to what I have to say. The book opens on a July afternoon in 1958 when a group of 124 Tibetan horsemen, members of the Wongyatsoa, or chiefdom, or sometimes called tribe, descended upon a lightly guarded government outpost in a distant corner of the grasslands of southern Qinghai province, part of the region known to Tibetan speakers as Amdo. The horsemen quickly overcame the defenders, killing 7 and riding off with a small number of guns or handguns, 1 machine gun, some grenades, and were told about 2,000 rounds of ammunition. They then ambushed the reconnaissance squad of the People's Liberation Army before reinforcements were able to track them down about 2 weeks later, I think it was, and put an end to the so-called Wungya incident. This wasn't an isolated event, however. Since early spring 1958, uprisings had sprung up one after another across the Amdo region, leading provincial leaders to declare a, quote, state of open counter-revolutionary armed rebellion. In response, the state unleashed a wave of retaliatory violence unparalleled in Amdo's recent history. Now, when the CCP cadres and PLA soldiers first marched into the region nearly a decade earlier, in late summer 1949, this really wasn't how they imagined things unfolding. In fact, in some ways, the bulk of my book is an exploration of the Communist Party's attempts to avoid this very outcome. While the CCP under Mao Zedong is usually considered an institution of radical social and political transformation, most of the book actually concerns strategies of state and nation building that are more notable for their relative moderation. And of course, relative is a relative term. These were policies that relied on co-option and to a degree consultation that we can throw together in a basket sort of under the moniker of the United Front. So today, I'm hopefully some brief comments. I'm going to talk a bit about the United Front itself before turning to what happened when the United Front failed, or more precisely, when it was abandoned at the start of the Great Leap Forward in 1958. Because I do think that it speaks directly to many of the things that are occurring in China as we speak today. So let me start by stating the obvious. China has problems at its peripheries, or on its edges, or on its ethnocultural borderlands, or however you want to describe them. As many of you are aware, in recent years, the Muslim-majority region of Xinjiang has witnessed unprecedented levels of state-directed securitization, surveillance, mass imprisonment, and forced labor. Meanwhile, the Tibetan Plateau has been the site of at least 3 major anti-state rebellions since 1949, depending on how you want to count them. And just in the last week or two, word has come out of large protests in Inner Mongolia over proposed eliminations to the Mongolian language instruction in schools. And while the massive protests seen in Hong Kong since 2019 might seem to have little in common with this type of ethnic strife along China's frontiers, I suggest that they all highlight the difficulty the state has encountered convincing diverse peoples on the edges of the former empire that they have a stake in membership in the Chinese nation. And what I was surprised to find while doing my research on Amdo in the 1950s is that party leaders, to a degree, once implicitly understood this problem and were determined to overcome it in fairly innovative ways. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the region, Amdo is one of the 3 major ethno-linguistic regions that constitute what is often considered to be Greater Tibet or Cultural Tibet or Ethnic Tibet. But it also forms part of the frontier zone or contact zone at which the Tibetan, Chinese, Mongolian, and Central Asian worlds collide. Today, the majority of Amdo lies in Qinghai province, while the remainder spills over into southern Gansu and northern Sichuan for people who are familiar with Western China. Its vast southern and western grasslands are inhabited primarily by Tibetans, but also Mongols and Kazakhs and some others, while the more densely populated lower-lying agricultural districts that sort of fan out mostly along its eastern frontiers are home to a mix of Chinese, Tibetan, Mongol, and Turkic-speaking communities. And in fact, not only Tibetans, but also Mongols, Salar, Hui Muslims, and others became swept up in the violence that occurred in 1958 and after. Now, Amdo was incorporated into the expanding and quite expansive Qing Empire in the 18th century. This does not mean, however, that Amdo became part of China, as some might anachronistically suggest today. Instead, it was one part of a vast, diverse, modular Manchu empire. And generally speaking, oversight was quite light, and rule was exercised mostly indirectly through a myriad of religious leaders and secular power brokers who essentially served as intermediaries between the imperial state and local society, or at least that was one of their roles. When the imperial system fell in 1912, in other words, when the Qing dynasty collapsed, the region came under the control of the so-called Ma family warlords, a Muslim military clan that would eventually ally with Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang or Nationalist Party. Despite its justifiable reputation for ruling through violence, time and again, the Ma regime was actually forced to negotiate different types of accommodations with an assortment of the region's religious and secular authorities, who once again were granted positions and rewards in exchange for various types of support for the regime or cooperation. So as I try to show in the book, during the first half of the 20th century, much of Amdo's political world continued to operate, at least broadly speaking, according to what we might think of as imperial practices, assumptions, or processes. So this was the challenge then that the Chinese Communist Party faced after 1949 in Amdo and many other ethnocultural borderlands of the former Qing Empire. How to transform what had been loosely governed imperial possessions into a unified, consolidated nation state. Or to put it another way, how do you convert relatively disconnected subject populations into a new singular political community? One now divided into a single majority population, the Han Chinese, and multiple ethnic minorities or minority nationality communities as the state defined them. And one of my core arguments is that the Communist Party's goal after 1949 was not just to build a state. It wasn't just control. It was to build or to create a nation. And while state building presumably could have been accomplished through force, the leadership realized that nation making requires constructing narratives and policies that are capable of convincing non-Chinese peoples of the former Qing Empire of their membership in a wider political community. And party leaders insisted that this transformation can only happen with the active participation of these people, as well as their eventual acquiescence. The CCP then, as now, was insistent that China was a single, historical, inseparable multinational state. Unlike today, however, in the 1950s, party leaders recognized that non-Han communities often had both deep but also legitimate grievances towards the Han majority. According to party leaders, this rift was the result of centuries of discrimination and exploitation committed by the Han Chinese majority against ethnic minority communities, what it referred to as Great Han Chauvinism. If the overwhelmingly Han CCP wanted to gain the support of what it was again now calling minority nationalities, it concluded that it needed to eradicate the cause or the root of this hostility, which it unequivocally identified as Han chauvinism. So that's what it sort of tried to do in Amdo, or one of the main things it tried to do. The strategy the CCP employed in these attempts to repair the tear in this aspirational nation was called the United Front. And without going into too many details here, the United Front has a long history in China that many of you might know that stretches back almost to the birth of the Communist Party. And more recently, it's been making headlines in the international media as the agency tasked with polishing China's global image through such so-called soft power instruments as sponsoring Confucius Institutes, for instance, and perhaps some more nefarious activities as well. But scholars have paid little attention to the role of the United Front in China, particularly during the early years of the People's Republic, when it was tasked with gaining the vital support of important non-party elements and non-proletarian elements of Chinese society and incorporating them into the new nation. This is despite Mao Zedong himself having declared the United Front one of the three magic weapons, so-called, of the Chinese Revolution. And what limited scrutiny the United Front has received has mainly been focused on the party's attempts to co-opt and control non-party intellectuals. But by contrast, little scholarship has been directed toward another major target of the United Front, which are these non-Han communities such as Tibetans and others in Amdo. And it's most basic in Amdo and other of these minority regions. The United Front referred to a transitional period of indeterminate length during which time class struggle would be de-emphasized or even got rid of in favor of forming alliances with the region's religious and secular leadership. People who had these types of intermediary roles under the Ma's and before that the Qing Empire, and would now serve as leaders of what ostensibly were to be called nationality autonomous areas. Of course, this arrangement wasn't intended to be permanent. While the United Front in Amdo maintained the trappings of an imperial relationship or a traditional imperial relationship, as I show, it was self-consciously designed as a transformative mechanism of nation building first and then socialist transformation second. So for instance, Zhou Renshan, who was the director of the Provincial United Front Work Department in Shanghai, insisted that the United Front itself was a, quote, social reform suited to the unique conditions of minority regions. By harnessing the charismatic authority of local elites in support of programs that promise things like autonomy, equality, respect for local cultures, material prosperity, freedom of religion, and so forth, party leaders like Zhou confidently predicted that class awareness and what they called patriotic consciousness would both slowly rise. And as that happened, parochial and superstitious attitudes that protected the system that the party felt was dominated by hereditary headmen and monastic leaders would dissipate and then totally disappear. At that point, the masses themselves would demand what the party called democratic reforms, or the full political integration of the region, and socialist transformation, in other words, collectivization. And the period of the United Front could come to its peaceful conclusion. Through this process, Amdo's population would, in Director Zhou's words, be gradually, voluntarily, and organically absorbed into socialist China. So before moving forward, I want to make two quick points. First, unlike some commentators, I see no evidence that the United Front was some sort of cynical ruse meant to placate local elites until the CCP was in a position to forcibly implement its agenda. It's easy enough to come to that conclusion if you start in 1958 and work backward, but contemporary internal sources simply don't support that premise. Instead, in the 1950s, Amdo, the United Front was considered by its proponents to be a progressive alternative to the treatment of minorities in the capitalist West, for one, and this vehicle for nation building as well, and as such served as the institutional ethos, I argue, of all work in Amdo and presumably other regions like it. Secondly, and I really want to be clear about this, just because it was earnestly pursued doesn't mean in any way that I'm suggesting that the CCP's actions in Amdo and other minority areas was justified. What it instead reveals are severe power imbalances that existed in a system that combined centralized political power with demands for meaningful popular participation. Although the United Front was meant to operate through consultation rather than compulsion, as I think I demonstrate over and over in the book, these power imbalances ensured that both decision-making and the coercive capacities were always in the hands of party elites. They were never in the hands of the so-called Tibetan masses. And the masses were never given true voice or a genuine choice in any of this. Excuse me. In fact, within the United Front, within the party, United Front gradualism existed in constant tensions with a revolutionary impatience that was deeply suspicious of these practices that, for example, eschewed class struggle in favor of allying with members of what they sometimes referred to as the feudal leadership of Amdo. And as I show in perhaps excruciating detail in the book, as the decade wore on, class exploitation gradually supplants Han chauvinism as being identified as the primary impediment to economic development as well as to national unity. Along with it, the drumbeat calling for democratic reforms and collectivization grew louder and louder, but it grew louder and louder on behalf of the masses by party cadres, not necessarily from the masses themselves, I argue. Finally, at the outset of the Great Leap Forward in 1958, checks on Han chauvinism were eliminated, clearing the path for rapid collectivization. And this sort of threw fuel on an already explosive situation, and the result was a rebellion that began in mid-February in the southern part of Gansu province. A headman from the Nura Soa in southern Gansu, we're told, invited a government work team to a local monastery for Losar, or New Year's banquet that year. And according to Chinese sources, this was actually an ambush. Supposedly, a bunch of monks jumped out with knives and tried to get them. True or not, the Amdo Rebellion had begun. And contemporary sources tell us that in a very short time, it had spread throughout the southern Gansu regions, these Tibetan regions of southern Gansu, and even spilled into the neighboring Muslim areas of Linsha, which is, as some of you will know, is a core area of the Hui community. As security forces spilled into southern Gansu, insurgents slipped into neighboring regions of Qinghai, first in Repgong, then to Xunhua, and finally by April 30th, citing uprisings in Huangnan, Hainan, Golok, and Yushu prefectures, which is, if we had a map here, you'd see is pretty much all of southern and most of eastern Qinghai. The Qinghai Party Committee announced, quote, "This is a counter-revolutionary armed rebellion, a long-term conspiracy, planned and organized to destroy nationality unity, oppose socialism, oppose the people's government, and oppose the Communist Party of China." Declaring that a common thread linked these many uprisings, it added, "Religion is at their core, monasteries and mosques are their headquarters." And it was, the committee gravely concluded, a life or death class struggle. So as you'd imagine from these pronouncements, the state's response was swift, it was heavy, and it was brutal. Resistance would continue for several years. In fact, most sources say that it continued for 5 years. However, between late spring and early autumn, security forces overwhelmed insurgents in one region after another. Still, victory on the battlefield wasn't enough for party leaders. Once a locality had been pacified militarily, the provincial leadership ordered that a speaking bitterness campaign be launched to bring about its, quote, political surrender as well. Speaking bitterness, as some of you might know, was a time-tested practice among the Chinese Communist Party, in which members of the masses would be encouraged or maybe coerced to publicly recount the exploitation and humiliation of the old society and its ruling class, and thereby arouse or maybe manufacture class consciousness and class hatred. In the process, these designated class enemies, who were mostly these pre-1949 elites who had been these United Front intermediaries for the last 10 years, they would be identified, dragged in front of their accusers at mass meetings, made to confess their crimes, dispossessed of their wealth, and in some cases physically assaulted and sometimes even killed. If the United Front preached gradual transformation, speaking bitterness was more akin to sort of like shock therapy, I guess. By the end of the year, the vast majority of Amdo's traditional religious and secular leadership had been deposed, tortured, and incarcerated. and many of them were already dead for various reasons. By then, a contemporary report celebrated that 731 of Qinghai's 859 Tibetan Buddhist monasteries had been closed, and nearly half of its almost 55,000 monks and nuns returned to the laity. Now, a central claim then and now is that the reforms in Amdo in 1958 and after were implemented at the behest of the laboring masses. However, contemporary reports paint a starkly different picture. In the months and years following the rebellion, rather than a vigorous mass movement aimed at completely destroying feudal rule and smashing the brutal exploitation of the livestock-owning class, as documents claim, much of Amdo was enveloped in a cloud of political terror and state violence that could really strike anywhere. Rather than an organic transformation, as Zhou Renshan had once promised, democratic reforms and socialist transformation were achieved through overwhelming and often indiscriminate deployment of violence. And evidence of this violence is littered across official Chinese sources, as well as a spattering of Tibetan eyewitness accounts. In some, these suggest that PLA and auxiliary forces responded to the Amdo Rebellion with a campaign similar in tactics and brutality to many of history's infamous counterinsurgencies. Figures certainly vary widely, and they should be valued more as indicators of scale than for their statistical accuracy. But in October 1959, the Provincial Party Committee reported that security forces had already eliminated an astonishing and frankly unsubstantiated 121,752 enemies. Now, the Chinese word they use, xiaomie, is pretty elastic, but here it seems to have included those killed, captured, or who had fled the province. By then, another source proclaimed that nearly 42,000 quote-unquote evildoers of all stripes were in custody. A classified report produced in the 1980s admitted that in 1958 alone, there were 23,260 deaths in Qinghai due to wrongful arrest and wrongful verdicts. And according to figures published in 1996 and then redacted afterwards, between 1958 and 1959, 52,000 people were arrested in Qinghai alone for participating in this rebellion. And these figures are mostly distinct from the devastation wrought by the Great Leap Forward that was happening at the same time. Despite contemporary claims of historically bountiful harvests, by 1959, the grain situation in Amdo had grown desperate. And at the height of the famine in 1960, Qinghai's death rate was second only to that of Guizhou province in China's south. Older Tibetan and Salar villagers that I interviewed uniformly described famine conditions of really horrific proportions. Ironically, one Salar gentleman recalled that he survived the period relatively well only because he spent it in a labor camp. Noting that none of Qinghai's regions escaped the famine, Governor Yuan Renyuan later admitted that many quote-unquote counter-revolutionaries arrested for sabotaging infrastructure were actually desperate people scavenging bits of food to eat and pieces of scrap metal to use for cooking utensils and the like. And in a remarkable blunt admission, a report states that between November 1958 and May of the following year, 25% of the population of one township had died from a lack of food. Choosing the threat of execution over the near certainty of starvation, I should say, many of the survivors had fled into the grasslands to join what they were calling bandits. Another document added the remarkable admission that nearly 10% of the province's population had perished between, I think it's 1959 and 1961, while livestock numbers had plummeted. They've been reduced by a half. Speaking in front of his own cadre force in summer 1961, the newly appointed party secretary Wang Zhao did not mince words. He declared, quote, "Many people have died, birth rates have dropped considerably, people are thin, the land is barren, and the situation with animals is even more severe. The people have suffered greatly and nationality relations have become strained." I'm sure that was an understatement. He continued by admitting that, quote, "unforgivable crimes have been committed during the anti-rebellion efforts." He noted, for instance, that some units had killed prisoners at will, and that's a direct quote from the party secretary. And I could go on, but I'm not really relaying these figures and these anecdotes so much for shock value, but that in order for us to understand the longer-term impact of the Amdo Rebellion and its subsequent pacification, we need to get a grip on the scale of the violence that was committed against Tibetans and other communities in Amdo during those years, even if we can't really assume the accuracy of the figures. And to a degree, the Chinese Communist Party came to understand this as well. So if we jump ahead to 1976 and the days and weeks after the death of Mao, the new regime faced a daunting task that demanded it reinforce the legitimacy of party rule while attending to the widespread violence that had been committed in its name across China, right? Not just in Amdo, but across Chinese regions and others as well. The imperfect solution was to rehabilitate most of those purged during the campaigns of the Mao era, especially during the Cultural Revolution, while assigning the lion's share of blame to a small number of troublemakers. Now, on the surface, the problems the party faced in ethno-cultural borderlands like Amdo seemed to bear a passing resemblance to the crisis of legitimacy it faced more broadly across China. As a leading Tibetan cadre explained at the time in a petition to the CCP's senior leadership, quote, "Unless rebellion pacification became rehabilitation, it will not be possible to restore the party's reputation." This argument seems to have proved persuasive. Of the more than 52,000 people officially arrested for counter-revolutionary activity during and after the rebellion in Amdo, or actually just in Qinghai, authorities ultimately determined that an astonishing 44,000, or 84%, had been wrongly incarcerated. And other accounts suggested the numbers of people punished and then actually the percentage of those cleared were both considerably higher. However, the party faced, I argue the party faced a qualitatively different type of crisis of faith than in Amdo and other places like that than it did in predominantly Han regions. One that not only brought to question the legitimacy of CCP rule, but also the terms under which the region was first included in the Chinese nation state into modern China. For many in Amdo, the CCP and Chinese rule had never been legitimate. And that was the whole point of the United Front in the first place, to integrate Amdo Tibetans and others not just physically into the state, but also psychologically into the Han-dominated multinational nation. Back in 1987, the now deceased 10th Panchen Lama addressed this disconnection at a high-level government meeting. He cautioned that in Amdo, the memory of 1958 continued to be an obstacle to national unity. The Panchen Lama declared, quote, "People were subject to unspeakable atrocities. People were shot in groups of 10 or 20, concluding, I know that it's not good to speak about these things, but such actions have left deep wounds in the minds of the people." And so all of this brings to mind the words, I think, of the controversial French theorist Ernest Renan, who over a century ago remarked that nation building isn't a large part a process of forgetting. Above all, forgetting the violence, the physical violence, but also the epistemological violence that accompanies all transitions to nationhood. And to put it bluntly, in Amdo, this violence that accompanied the region's forced integration into the PRC and then the decades of state repression that followed have simply not been forgotten. And in fact, they are not only part of lived memory, but of lived experience for many Amdo Tibetans and others. So to conclude, it was never going to be easy to convince Amdo Tibetans and other communities on ethnic borderlands of the Chinese state that they were members of a Han majority nation. And my book suggests that there are reasons to be deeply skeptical that if left intact, the United Front could have worked its so-called magic. Maybe there is no magic weapon after all. Nevertheless, while the CCP's warnings against Han chauvinism in the 1950s were reductionist, at least they contained an implicit acknowledgement that creating a nation out of the disparate remnants of a fallen empire is hard and rarely can be achieved through ethno-cultural violence. At one point, party leaders acknowledged this. Watching today as the CCP applies increasingly coercive and assimilationist measures in restive border regions from Tibet to Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and even Hong Kong, it's clear that the lessons from its own past have not been heeded. And judging from Beijing's turn in recent years away from even the rhetoric of pluralism towards a more nakedly Han-centered ethno-nationalism, to me, the most sobering part is the realization that nation building, as it was once understood, at least in the 1950s in Amdo, seems no longer to be the goal, no longer the party's endgame on its ethno-cultural borderlands. So thank you very much. I look forward to talking more about this as we move forward.
Thank you very much. I think that was a fantastic presentation that gets at some of the core information and arguments in your book. I think, Benno, your book stands out for its granular localized detail in a non-Han region at this time in history. But some of the questions I have are a little bit broader and looking at kind of what this granular detail tells us about the PRC's nation building project, and most importantly about its the failures of that nation building project in certain frontier areas. You know, one of your main arguments is that efforts to integrate Amdo into a modern Chinese multinational nation-building project was generally a failure, and in your conclusion, you also suggest that that's and just now I think as well, that is a continued problem in terms of the PRC's nation-building project. So I'm wondering. You offer some hints, particularly in your introduction, for why this integration has failed consistently. And I'm wondering if you could articulate some of these reasons for us today, particularly as they relate not just to the example of Amdo, but to the PRC's general relationship with non-Han peoples.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a great question. I'll do my best. I could go a lot of ways with this, I think. I'm going to start where I sort of ended up in my short presentation by just stating the obvious again, that building a multi-ethnic nation is hard. We're struggling with that in this country right now, today. I'm speaking of the United States. I don't know where everybody else is, but where I'm sitting, we're still struggling with that. And we've been struggling with it for 200 plus years now. And and we continue to well, I'll leave it at that before I get myself in trouble. So this isn't just a Chinese problem. Let me start by saying that. But of course, there are distinct characteristics that we find in China that we might not find elsewhere, because modern China tried to do something that has perhaps never been done before. And I guess the other, well, I'll get. Which is to transform a vast, diverse empire intact into a nation state, and a particularly transformative nation state at that. And probably the only real comparable example is the Soviet Union, which ultimately collapsed along ethno-national lines. And I know it's a little more complicated than that, but nonetheless. So there really is no blueprint, I don't think, for how you do this. So it's not a situation of it's not a choose your own adventure book, right? It's not that they picked B instead of A and ended up in C instead of D. It's that how do you do this? I do think that they were innovative in terms of the United Front. They had this ambition, this goal. I think it was quite idealistic, maybe utopian at times, but it ran up against the real hard realities of Maoist China, in that it was this transformative state with a particular goal in mind, both in terms of transforming people into a singular nation, but also into a socialist state. And this is part of a longer project in China, right? Over the course of the 20th century, state builder after state builder of every political persuasion has tried to find a convincing argument for why there should be a multi-ethnic supranational China. And they made racialized arguments, they made historical arguments, they made arguments based on promises of economic development and prosperity. And a lot of these arguments make sense to the state, and they probably make sense to many people in the Han majority, which almost always is at the center of this nation, right? Everyone else has to come essentially to them. But they don't always make sense to, or are not convincing to many people on the borders and the borderlands, like Tibetans and Uyghurs and Mongols and others, especially people that have their own well-defined historical and literary traditions and cultures and religions that are so different from the Han Chinese, as well as transnational aspirations sometimes, right? Sometimes there are models of cross borders, as you well know, for alternatives to the Chinese nation. So again, maybe there's no magic weapon to change all this, so to speak. But having said that, if it was going to happen, I think it probably would have happened in the 1950s. Speaking of the Amdo region in particular, what's really interesting to me is the party marched in with really neatly parsed ideas and definitions of who was there already. Tibetans and Mongols and Tu and others Hui. But then they discovered that people in Amdo didn't necessarily identify themselves in these ways. And arguably, if the party had continued to pursue policies that promoted, and actually, I would say not continue, but they had promoted policies that promoted genuine political autonomy, genuine cultural autonomy, and genuine economic development that could have been driven by local interests, maybe we'd be in a different place than we are. What would that state look like? It's really hard to know. It really was never the intention of the party to do that, so it's hard for me to really, project that onto the future. And then just really quickly, the second opportunity might have been the 1980s, when there was something of a reckoning of the past, but it was never a real reckoning. The party very much directed how the past was going to be remembered, not just to ethnic minorities, so-called, but also to the Han Chinese state. So maybe if there had been some sort of genuine reconciliation or effort at reconciliation at that time, we might be in a different place than we are today. That didn't happen, and it wasn't going to happen. So these are kind of counterfactuals. So, in answer to your question, I'm just not very optimistic today. I think at this point, 70 years have passed. Ethnic and national identities that might have not been there in the 1950s have solidified. I just think it's a difficult sell right now. After what amounts to 70 years of sort of failed promises to say, hey, you're full citizens, you have an equal state in the political community. Even if the state was going to go and make those efforts, which I don't think it's going to do so, I think it's a little bit, it's too little too late, so to speak. So that's a pessimistic view of where we're at. But and I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but that's sort of the way I see the history unfolding over the past many decades and why we're at where we are today.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is going to be an area of future comparable research because, some of the things you mentioned about the 50s in the 1980s, very similar situation in Xinjiang, that those were the two opportunities where there was this engagement, and they quickly, as your book points out, in the 50s, they just stopped at a certain point. So I have one more question, and then I'll hand it to Tashi, and then we'll also get Q&A from the audience. In your introduction, you mentioned that your research began with a lot of interviews, but then you kind of cut that short, and you focused more on access to archives, particularly for political sensitivities, and you're certainly not the first person to experience this problem in non-Han areas of the PRC. I myself have experienced it, and I think that, with every day that situation is getting worse and worse to be able to actually engage non-Han people in social science research through interviews and participant observation, kind of ethnographic research. But I wanted to just hear your thoughts on, how these limits on research inside China limit our understanding of non-Han peoples and their lived experiences, as well as the regions that they live in.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm glad you asked that question, and I wish I had a more positive outlook on it or a good response. I'm not very optimistic about a lot of things right now, unfortunately, not just in China, but China's among them. And so this is a question I've been struggling with a lot. I'm sure you have as well, and all of our colleagues. How do we move forward from here? It's really, in a sense, an existential problem, and not just for our individual careers, but like you say, because we want to understand the lived experience. We want the people in these regions to have a voice. We want to give them the chance to have their own history and their own expressions of their lived experiences, like you say. That space is closing, right? What I did, I don't think I could do anymore. When I was living in Xining and Amdo and in Qinghai province, it wasn't just me. There was a group of really great scholars there, all doing some really interesting work. And it was sensitive, but it was still something that you could do as long as you were smart about it. And I think my book came out this year, and several other of those books are going to be coming out in the next year or two, and it's going to be a great boon for what we know about this region. But can you do that anymore? Can the next generation do that? Can we go back and do it? And I don't think we can right now. I think the political situation in China is such that that's not possible, but I also think that the tit-for-tat competition between the United States and China, for instance, in terms of the way we're treating Chinese scholars and Chinese students in this country, not only does it reflect bad on us, but it's going to come back and bite us probably when we want to go to China and we want to have access to China, whether it's just for edge school or language or if it's doing research like this. So I'm very concerned about the continued evaporation of the relationship between the two countries. The last thing I'll just say that, in the Tibet field, for a long time, when it was developing, we relied on studies done among the exile community, and and that was great and that was important. And I don't mean to knock that at all. But the great thing that happened in the 90s and in the 2000s was suddenly we had more and more access to Tibet, not necessarily to central Tibet, not necessarily to Lhasa so much, but to Amdo and Kham, the region to its south. And so then all of a sudden we got tremendous studies and research done on these communities that were still in China, A, and B, that weren't Lhasa based. So we had a different experience, on these borderlands. And that was such a great boon to the field of Tibetan studies, but also of modern Chinese studies, I think. And I do worry a little bit that with the access to these regions being limited, we're going to go back to the sort of China watcher or Tibet watcher positions that we once were, and have to work on these outside of China, which again, there can be benefits to that, but it also would mean that we don't really get to understand the lived experiences of people in these regions and their voices, and other people will be speaking for them as they once did. So it's a troubling situation, and I just don't see it getting better in the near term. Hopefully, in the long term.
Yeah. Well, and on that somber note,
Sorry.
I just want to remind people you can start typing questions into the Q&A. I'm going to hand over the floor to Tashi to ask some more questions of you, and I'll be back to read out some of the questions from our attendees. So, Tashi?
Hi.
Hello.
Hey, Benno. So let me just start by saying congratulations on the book. We're here, after all, to help launch your book to a broader public and hopefully straight into a public conversation, which is where provocative books like yours should be. So in my role as discussant, actually, contrary to what Sean just said, I'm going to be sharing some thoughts and commentary with some questions embedded. And Benno, you can respond however you'd like to these. Hopefully, this will provoke more questions in a very dynamic Q&A session, which is what we're looking forward to. All right, so I want to begin by saying just how important it is that we are now we now have our first English language account of the 1958 rebellion in the region of Tibet called Amdo. We've actually had chronicles in Tibetan and Chinese, but this was a missing piece in English about a traumatic moment that was enormously consequential politically, and in fact, in every other way. In some areas of Amdo, an entire generation of Tibetans, especially men, disappeared. So it really turned the Amdo region inside out, and the study is long overdue. So Benno, I first commend you for taking on this project. And what it does, in part, is help revise our sense of a ground zero for Tibet's contemporary politics, which we often take as 1959 and the flight of the 14th Dalai Lama to India. But in fact, the year that's remembered as cataclysmic in Amdo is generally 1958. And in fact, for much of Kham, that ground zero was actually earlier, 1956, when aerial bombings began. And rivers ran red. So that's still what causes a lot of trauma today to elderly Tibetans. That's what they talk about, not so much 1959, but 1956. So just to say that what we need to do is to look at this 4-year period between 1956 to 1959 together as the turning point, but from what and toward what? And that is one of the key questions that your study raises. How should we be politically interpreting what happened in this pivotal moment? And your book addresses this question by looking at what you call the techniques of rule. So the processes and the practices through which the Amdo region was incorporated into the modern Chinese state. And you do this drawing on Uradenbulag's way of thinking about sub-imperialism as an interpretive frame to make sense of the relationship between elite, center, and the peripheries. Okay, so let me just pause to say the book and your study is challenging, also innovative, and I want to pause here just to say that this leads to all sorts of interesting consequences. We're reading your reading of the party's archive, right? So through reading party documents, what can we glean from that? So I've written this down here. I was so struck by what you said about the United Front in the text. You talk about how we need, as readers and as analysts, we need to be taking seriously the United Front in its own time and by its own logic. How it was considered by its advocates as a legitimate progressive alternative to strategies of nation building. That just really struck me. Basically, you are looking at something that needs to be understood, but drawing on, not just drawing on those documents, but also very seriously taking the norms, right, of the United Front. So this is actually something that many others may start to do in terms of developing a perspective and analysis of many historical moments. First of all, I think your real commitment to that does a lot of things. It brings insight that we generally don't have in the discourse. And one I found refreshing, something that I've been saying for a long time as well, is the fact that we read the notion of autonomy wrong, right? And the whole idea of the Minzuchu, the regional autonomy system, right? What you call the nationality autonomy. That thing, we always lament for generations. We've seen studies where people said, oh, the right to autonomy is a fiction. It doesn't exist in China. And the truth is, from the perspective of the party and the state builders and the nation builders, it was doing exactly what it was meant to be doing, right? It was not a devolutionary process. It was a unifying process. The whole point to have a Minzuchi Zizhifa was to bring the all of these areas that had never been under control before, right? In history, actually, but into the new state process. So that kind of thing, I think, was really interesting to see in your analysis. And at the same time, I think there are risks, right? So without going too much into the details of the book, but I did find it really, it just made me stop in my tracks. You talk about Mabufang. In building your analysis of the 1950s, you talk about the thing that preceded it in the earlier Republican period. And, you know, this person who still looms large in people's minds, I think he's still someone that is very huge in people's memories. Even 100 years later, it's sort of inherited in terms of what terror he caused and how much dread there is around him. But in your analysis of the sub-imperial, I think you call the United Front sub-imperial practices, and through that process of thinking of that relationship of intermediary figures, right, between the elite and the frontier, you actually call Mapufang an indigenous headman, right? So here, I think what's really challenging is to think about what we mean by indigeneity in this context, because we're so we have a framework, right? And it's very elegant, actually. It's such an interesting read. But then I think we can also start to try to fit the facts into these containers that don't exactly fit, right? Really questions what we mean by indigenous. That said, I think one of the major projects that has come out of the last generation, and I think is really something that we need to continue talking about because it's not done yet. I feel like despite the pessimism that you feel on these issues, Benno, there's a lot of work to be done, and but we know that a lot has changed, right, through New Qing history, and that has even filtered back to state scholars in Beijing and elsewhere. So in that context, I think this study that you have, I feel like your primary preoccupation is to go from understanding the relationship of the empire to imperial formations to the nation state, right, as it is in formation. Here's the thing. I feel that in the way that it's that I read it, that we can take the notion of Amdo, and in fact the notion of Tibet, and not just decenter that, but just really dismantle the ways in which people, see the sense of subjectivity, right? You see that. And there's this sort of constant that runs through, which is the notion of a Chinese nation. So let's say we're calling it the Zhonghua Minzu, right? And this is the resonance of your work to the contemporary politics. I think this is absolutely an essential conversation going on among elite policy analysts and people making policy in China today, is about what it is that we're talking about, Zhonghua Minzu, how it's being pursued. So in the notion, if we do not problematize it enough, what happens is that we get the sense that it's sort of a prefabricated sort of sense of what's happening, and we get to that moment of 1912, 1913, right? When suddenly, there is this promulgation of a new republic, right? And the way that it's not just here, it's often done. How we describe, the 13th Dalai Lama's Declaration of Independence and Jizutamba Hudukdu's, the declaration in Mongolia, the sense that these Tibetans and Mongolians are sort of escaping the Chinese nation, right? And I think the problem is that there's a sense of we projected sort of that it is obvious what it is, and this basically it's a centrifugal process that we kind of impute to that, right? That there's this running away from the new Chinese Republic, when in fact it was never unified in the first place, right? And then the idea that Zhonghua Minzu was invented, very recently, a decade and a half earlier, it was worked out. And someone who, many would say is the father of the Chinese nation, Sun Yat-sen, really, for a long time, he insisted that Tibetans and Mongolians, of course, are not supposed to be within this new republic, within the Sinitic world, because all the people, all the heathens who never learned Chinese, all those who never got to know Confucius, all these people should not be in this fold, right? Instead, it should be, there's a lot of debate, it should be the Koreans, it should be the Japanese, it should be the Vietnamese. The Sinitic cultures are supposed to eventually come into the Republic of China, but not Tibetans and Mongolians. So I guess the point that I'm trying to capture here is that in such an elegant and interesting and important analysis based on materials that we don't easily see, right? That we need to also have this very strong sense of the constructedness of the idea of the Chinese nation. Yes, they're trying to build it. There is a norm here, and we're being asked to stand in that normative space. But at the same time, we have to see how entirely recently constructed, and for very political reasons, because Sun Yat-sen changed his. By the time it was time to promulgate the Zhonghua Minzu, the Republic of China, he completely changed his story, right? I just wanted to say that, because what we have in truth is a group of people sitting in Nanjing declaring the Republic of China that goes all the way out to what is all the Republic of Mongolia today, when they could control little more than metropolitan Nanjing. I mean, in truth, right? Okay, so how do we put that all into a picture that can be helpful for understanding what is going on today? And I just want to say that you're primarily focused on the sense of nationhood and how that's being built through these processes, but your work also really opens up, it lends itself to talking about the state building process today. And I just really appreciate that, because I feel that that is a whole conversation that needs to take place, that the nature of the Chinese state, understanding the workings, the techniques of rule, and just how power works right now. That is something that I think is part of the work that needs to be done. And in the process of doing that, I just also want to say how important it is we find a way to bring in the voices of people who are experiencing the forms of state and the experiencing the exercise of power today. So I just want to put those thoughts out there. Benno, whichever parts you want to respond to.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your comments and your close reading of the book. Yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't my intention to assume that the Chinese nation was fully formed in 1912 or 1913, or that it was, I'm really trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to suggest that it was something that was created over decades and decades of time, that it didn't impact places like Amdo immediately, which is why local headmen continued to be able to operate in sort of an imperial frontier type of atmosphere well into the 1950s, frankly, and would have done so longer had they had the Chinese state not acted the way it did after 1958. So I appreciate that, and I don't know what else to say about that other than to say that my intention is really to investigate those processes rather than assume that they were in existence at one point or another. And I appreciate you pointing all that out. Yeah, and Ma Bufang, I struggled with how to treat Ma Bufang. He clearly is a villain to most people that I've talked to in Amdo, and he's also the primary villain of any state-generated source on Qinghai or Northwest China for this time. So it's an overwhelming sense of how horrible this man was and this regime was. And certainly they committed tremendous acts of violence against Tibetan communities and others. So it's not my intention to change that or to rescue him somehow. But what I was trying to say is that Hui Muslims were an indigenous, had long been part of the Amdo world. And certainly the rise of Hui Muslim military and economic power, political power in the 20th century was a new thing. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that ethnic and sort of ethno-religious lines were neatly drawn between Muslim communities and Tibetan communities and others. And one thing I was doing is pushing back against some that suggest it was Muslims against Tibetans and vice versa in the first half of the 20th century, when I think there was a much more complex political alignments going on, where Tibetans, the Gyalwa chiefdom in Repgong, for one reason or another, allied with the Ma Bufang regime against Labrang Monastery, for instance, in the 1920s. And what I'm saying is that we shouldn't necessarily judge those alignments based on our anachronistic ideas of nationality or ethnicity or religious, solidarity, because these things hadn't yet formed in the first half of the 20th century, and maybe they're not completely formed today either. So that's really what I was trying to suggest with some of those anecdotes and suggestions. Is there anything you'd like me to address in particular? I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe this is a good example of the fact that when we're talking about contiguous areas, right, then how we assign categories onto what it is that's existing. So just taking as an example, because actually your work is primarily on the 1950s, but going back to Ma Bufang, who's from Linxia, right? He becomes a giant figure for building the province of Qinghai, but he's perceived as from outside, right, as an external force, and his massacres of the Golok area, for example, it goes to a very different area. So the question is, where do we draw the lines, right? And how do we say who is indigenous? That's the question. And I'm just saying that as much as we want to, we have explanatory power in our theoretical frameworks, but to what extent does it really help make sense of how this was experienced? Because, there was an entire wiping out of communities.
No, absolutely there was. But there also was, the Qing state also wiped out communities at different times. And yet Amdo Tibetans would still go to the the prefecture seat at Shunhua, for instance, to make their claims for legal cases. So just because there was I certainly never assumed that there wasn't conflict. I think the history of Amdo is in many cases, conflict is one of the major things that comes through between communities. But I'm trying to, I guess I'm trying to complicate assumptions about what those conflicts were based on. So yes, Mabufang absolutely eradicated some communities in Golok, and I don't know a ton about this, but I believe some communities in Golok made common cause with him for various reasons. Maybe they felt they had to just to protect themselves. So I don't think we can say it was Golok versus the Ma regime. It was a much more complicated internal dynamics that were going on, and these are sort of the dynamics that nation states don't allow or don't want to allow. This is what they want to. They want to simplify and eradicate and normalize and homogenize, and that's sort of the processes I'm trying to think about. And maybe I was successful, maybe I wasn't, but so that's sort of where I was coming from.
You make the point so well, and maybe we can move on to the Q&A with the broader audience. But thank you, Benno.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. So we already do have some questions from the audience. First of all, from Benjamin Hopkins, who's director of the Seeger Center. He wants to congratulate you on a great presentation and fantastic book. And he asks the provocative question, to what extent is your story simply the story of settler colonialism with a CCP flavor? And do you see this to be transferable or resonant to other frontiers of the PRC or even to other national contexts?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben, wherever you are, and I appreciate it. And I know this is a subject that's probably close to your heart, Sean, as well. I don't see it in the 1950s as simple settler colonialism, at least not in the southern grasslands that I'm mostly studying at, the pastoral regions, where the party had very sparse feet on the ground. Right, they were not there to. I really believe that at least in these areas, at least in the early years, they were there to transform rather than they were there to occupy, so to speak. Now, that might be different. I mean, the Tsadam Basin, for instance, where there was mineral wealth, I should say, they did settle these areas, and they did bring in Chinese settlers and technicians and eventually young students into this area. But that doesn't happen in most of southern Amdo. During this period, there were plans very briefly in 1956 to do so, and then again, I believe in the Great Leap Forward, but these didn't happen until much later. So I don't think it's easily transferable to everywhere. I think one thing we need to start making comparisons to other so-called minority areas, but we also in doing so we need to make sure we recognize that they weren't all treated the exact same. And I think sort of Inner Mongolia is an obvious case of settler colonialism from early on. And then I think, as from your own research, we know that in parts of Xinjiang, this is very much part of the process or the goal from, I think, from the 1950s, at least in northern parts of Xinjiang. So without knowing if I'm correct, I would think that the areas that I'm studying are more similar to southern Xinjiang. Where, yes, the party came in, yes, they did try to implement certain programs, but there wasn't a concerted effort of settlement or of cultural transformation for some time. As I show in my book, the Great Leap Forward changed things quite rapidly in southern Amdo. But so I do think that there's degrees and there's gradations of what settler colonialism can be, but I don't think it's a sort of a standard PRC, settler colonialism with Chinese characteristics. I don't think we can say that for at least the 1950s in southern Amdo.
Yeah, and I think, it does seem that, even in Xinjiang, you don't really get significant settlement to the late 50s, and then really catapulting forward is the Cultural Revolution.
I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Just from the documents, as I think out loud, they don't talk about bringing people in. In fact, they say things like, we cannot transform pastures to farms, to agriculture. This would be ecologically disaster as well as demographically a disaster. And they said over and over again that we're going to make these areas that make local people the masters of their own homes. And to the degree that that was possible in under these political contexts, I think they meant that. Again, referring to what Tashi was saying about autonomy and what that actually meant. But all these promises, of course, go out the window very quickly when political campaigns ramp up. And that's what happens in the Great Leap Forward, for instance. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that sort of occurred to me.
So we have that's from two different students, one from the University of Kansas and one from GW, who are interested in the kind of future of self-determination of some sort, particularly for Tibetans, but in other maybe nationality areas. And I'll just preface this with something that's kind of interests me. You mentioned earlier this period in the 1950s and the way you described the United Front was really a period where there was an attempt by the state to accommodate and to get people to willfully join the state. And then you also referenced another period that resonates with me with Xinjiang in the 1980s, where I kind of talk about it in my book as an opportunity where the state could have gone in a different direction. It is easy, I think, to look at the situation now and be ultimately very pessimistic. But can you see any kind of prospects if the Chinese state was to change its perspective on this, that there could be more autonomy in self-determination on some level?
It's hard to know how that would happen and when that would happen. It certainly seems like under the present regime and in the present, not just internal pressures, but global pressures, and we see sort of the rise of ethno-nationalism all over the world, not just in China, of course, that doesn't seem particularly likely at this moment. Can that change? Yeah, I guess it can. I think it would. I think there would have to be some sort of spark. There would have to be some sort of event that would make the state want to change. And it's hard for me. I always get to say, well, I'm a historian. I'm not an anthropologist or a political scientist or something like that. So I don't have to prognosticate or at least such a things. It's like a get out of jail easy free card or something. I wouldn't say that there's no possibility. And arguably, I know there are people in Beijing and elsewhere that would like to see a more accommodationist policy. And there are a lot of people who have pointed to Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, who was one of the architects of the original Minzu nationality policy, at least in Northwest China, and point to him as an example of how we might return to a better time of relations between the state and some minority communities, so-called. And there's a lot of hope. There was hope for that when Xi Jinping came to power, based on his father's resume or reputation. That hasn't come to bear. And it seems like people who are hardliners or are in ascendancy, not just in political circles, but also in academic circles. And I don't know enough about the intricacies of what goes on at think tanks in China to be able to say whether or not that's going to last or not. But at this moment, things seem to be pointing in the other direction. Could there be some sort of jolt that changes things? I think there can be. And I know there would be people in China of every nationality that would welcome that if that were to happen. So we can certainly hope that could come to bear.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's something all historians know, is that things can change, and they often do, but they're awfully difficult to predict.
That's right.
We have a question from Katie Jarrett, who is an analyst, and she has kind of two questions, and I'll kind of put them together about your interviews. One is whether you did interview any people in exile outside of China, and what did you find in terms of doing interviews locally, in terms of the kind of problem of self-censorship, or just the feelings of danger in terms of political sensitivities? And I might just add to that, I mean, it's an interesting question given what you said earlier about the growing lack of access to people inside China. I think what we find is informants both inside and outside have their limits on the information they can provide, and maybe you can kind of muse a little bit on the relative merits.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I did do interviews. I did several dozen interviews with Tibetan and Salar people, mostly in Xunhua County, which is it's a county in eastern Qinghai that is quite diverse in its demographics. And they were fascinating, and they were heartbreaking, and it was really an amazing experience. And I would basically go to small villages with my research assistant, and we would hang out with local people, elder people usually, and sometimes others. And it was quite an education, because you get trained to do oral histories, and they tell you how everything has to be perfect. There has to be no noise, and there has to be no this, no that. And then it turns out the guy's got a tractor, and he's, any number of things can happen to make the interview not go the way you think it's going to. And it was really a wonderful experience. In the end, I didn't use them, and I didn't continue doing interviews because I didn't feel like I could really protect the safety of the people that I was interviewing and my research assistants. And that was basically because I was talking to one of my research assistants after coming back from one of these trips, and I think we were quite, we did the things we were supposed to do, let's put it that way, to protect people. But even then, he was reading through the transcripts, and I realized that he was sort of acting weird. And I asked him if everything's okay. And he basically said that when he was in the village, talking and chatting and drinking tea, it all seemed fine. We do this type of thing. But then when he saw it on a piece of paper and started writing it out, he realized how incredibly sensitive talking about these things were. And so I decided that, it's not worth it. And I was fortunate that I didn't need to rely on them. I had these other documents that provided, it's a different story. If I relied on oral sources, it would be there would be more Tibetan and Salar voice, for instance, and that would be more agency on their part, but it would be a memory book. The thing about memories is that they're not primary sources from the moment. They're primary sources of the moment they were related to you, not of the events that when they were taken. In other words, I was able to, through my documents. Documents are outcome blind, right? They don't know what's going to happen next. But interviewers or interviewees know what happened, and everything that they tell you is filtered through that knowledge that comes afterwards. So oral sources can be wonderful, but they're also a tricky thing. All sources are tricky, but they have a particular methodological issues that you have to deal with. And you can, if you choose to. I told a different story based on documents created mostly by the Chinese state, and there's limitations to that as well. But that's, there are a lot of books out there that people can write if they can get the access. I didn't do exile interviews for some of those reasons. Again, if you're going to do interviews with people in exile, I think it's filtered through an additional layer of everything that they know based on their exile experience, which again doesn't mean that it's not valid. It's absolutely valid. All these people's stories are valid. I don't mean that. I just mean that's a different story that you're getting. And I chose to tell the story that I chose to tell for the reasons that I did. And I'll stand by that. But certainly somebody else can do that, and hopefully do a wonderful book that will give more Tibetan voice to these events.
So, Benno, while we're working on getting the other questions in order, I thought I'd ask a further question about a couple things. One, first, just to make everyone feel less pessimistic,
yes,
just to say that there's a lot that I think in terms of young scholars out there who are working on their various projects related to regions of the People's Republic of China that are not Chinese, let's put it that way. There's so much right now that I think that has become really visible work to do. And I do feel that your assessment of the whole autonomy conversation is a starting point for that. It's really important. So which is to say that we have a discourse problem the way that we have been talking about these things have not been helpful, because I think we start with a liberal framing of what we think is supposed to be happening in the PRC, and it has never happened that way, right? And so how do we, really assess that? How do we build new projects that start with a different framing ourselves? So first of all, there's a lot of work on that front to be done. I don't know what you have in the works coming up. Maybe you can talk about how your new work will be connected to that, because I feel that that's very important. And also just the politics of the archive. Wow, it's just possibly one of the most sensitive things you can do, actually, is first get access to the archives, and then what you do with it. I mean, the whole thing is, especially for Tibet, across the Tibetan region, exceedingly sensitive. Even people who work in the archives, they before they enter in, they're just completely examined every time, because it's considered such an important state issue, right? So it's amazing that you have access to the documents that you did get access to. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that process.
To be honest, I really can't, for those reasons. I'd rather not talk about those in detail. And I don't think that would happen again. I think it was the right time at the right place. For what one thing I think that, to get to your previous point about the liberal framing and these types of things, one thing I try to do is to, I think one problem we've had in China studies in general is that we've dismissed the communist project there as some sort of false premise, that it didn't really have real meaning, that it was a time of craziness, it was illogical. And I don't think any of those things are true. I mean, we can certainly disagree with what happened, but I think we do need to go back and try to understand those ideologies and those practices in their own terms the best we can. And so that's one of the things I try to do, and I think people are starting to do a better job. But in many cases, people that had worked on borderlands in past generations maybe didn't have the training that they do now in Chinese history, in Chinese politics, that allows them, I think, to do a little deeper dive into some of these questions that you're raising. And I hope I didn't offend anybody by saying that. I don't remember if there was another question or another point that you brought up.
Just from my perspective, I feel like there's a lot of new work that can be done in terms of rethinking the making of the Chinese state.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think, again, the question is sources. Sometimes we don't need new sources. Sometimes we can use old sources and rethink them, as I think maybe you're suggesting in some cases. What I'm looking at right now is actually Northwest China during the Republican period. Mostly, not mostly, but in part because of the difficulty of getting primary sources for after 1949, but sort of addressing some of those issues that you brought up earlier, some of your skepticism of the way I maybe frame some things, and thinking about Northwest China. The way we tend to think about China is it fell apart in 1912, right? And then finally got put together after 1949. And what I argue is that, well, no, it was never together. There never was a China. It didn't break apart. What actually happened is people brought things together through various measures, whether they're ideological, whether they're coercive, whether they're economic. So you can see state building and nation building. That's quite different than the frame that it was often looked at. The warlord period is a time of fracturing. Well, arguably, it was not. Arguably, some of the warlords actually helped bring modern the Chinese state together, and the Communist Party then built on that after 1949. So that's early stages. That's kind of some of the things that I'm thinking about.
Thanks.
Yeah, pleasure.
I think we've got the next question line.
Yep. Yeah, and I would just say, I think, just to add to that conversation, I think that the new Qing history has influenced the new tendencies in some of the post-Qing analysis is what's happened. And you can also in terms of the Republican period in Xinjiang, Justin Jacobs' book is kind of a very good new perspective that, is not necessarily about news sources. It's about, I think, the perspective. Yeah.
Right.
So we have a question that's I think, an interesting question from a graduate student from the University of Cambridge, Jason. And he notes, that in the Soviet case, there are books such as Hirsch's Empire of Nations, which you refer to in your book, that shed light on the role of metropole-based ethnographers and local elites in constructing a multinational party state. And he refers to this in terms of also geological expeditions and geographic done by Soviet scholars, or Soviets would call them scientists. He wanted to know if there existed a similar literature or a similar movement among Chinese academics at the time that were working in step with the CCP and kind of the nation building project.
The answer is yes. Thomas Mullany's book on Yunnan province talks very clearly about the role of ethnographers in building this Minzu project in that region. And you do have something. In northwest China, in Qinghai, Gansu, Ningxia, these areas, in the 1930s in particular, there's a great interest in sort of exploring these areas for various reasons. As a base area against the Japanese, for instance, as a place to settle colonists, as settler colonialism, as you point out, for natural resources, and just for scientific or ethnographic interest. So there really is tremendous interest in these regions in the 30s, and then especially after the government was forced out of Nanjing in 1937 and forced into Western China. This picks up even more in all of Western China. And it does carry over to the PRC. I don't see a lot of this in my documents in Qinghai. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. And it certainly particularly happened in places like the Saddam Basin, where there was this exploration for oil and other types of natural resources. But in a place like southern Amdo, the grasslands, it seems to be less obvious. Now, there are absolutely people going into these areas saying, well, these Tibetan nomads have been nomads for centuries, but they don't do it right. This is not the way you should be a pastoralist. They need to graze their cattle on this mountain at this time of the year, not on that mountain. So there is all this there are hints at this sort of high modernist thinking, to use sort of James Scott's terms, and imposing it on places like Amdo. But the one thing I'll say just last is that, unlike what Tom Mullany sees in Yunnan province, where ethnographers go in there and they identify people, essentially, to simplify, in Qinghai, they walked in, they felt like they already knew who everybody was. They said, literally, Peng Dehuai says in 1949, the general, there's Tibetans, there's Mongols, there's Hui, there's some Kazakh, and Han, of course, right? Maybe I missed somebody. So the project was a little bit different there. There was assumption that we know what they already are. And actually the problem was convincing them of what they are. They had to convince Tibetans that they were Tibetans before they could convince them that they were part of this Zhonghua Minzu, this Chinese nation that we were talking about. So that's where I see some of this stuff in the case of Qinghai and Northwest China.
And so I'm going to ask the final question.
Okay.
One of the reasons that I got interested in Xinjiang was because I was studying in the Soviet Union, and there I found that the ethnic minorities or nationalities were much more integrated into Soviet culture. I had read a lot of Sovietology that said, oh, the Muslims of the Soviet Union are about to revolt. And I found that was not the case. There had been a lot of success with acculturation. And then I went over to Xinjiang during my winter break, and found that that was not the case there. And, this was right across the border, people with very similar cultural, linguistic backgrounds and historical backgrounds, with the exception of the difference being the Soviet Union and the PRC. And at one point, I told my one of my advisors, who was a historian, that I wanted to write my dissertation on those differences, and she said, "That's way more than you can ever get into a dissertation. There's so much to talk about there." So, in a couple minutes, I'm wondering if you could just get at a piece of why has the PRC, you mentioned that it's always a difficult job to create a multinational nation building project, but why was the PRC so much different than the Soviet experience, where, a lot of political scientists will often point out that the PRC based its nationality system on the Soviet one. But that may be more kind of the United Front aspect of the PRC than what followed.
Yeah, that's a big question, and I'm not really, I'll take a shot at it. Well, first of all, let me take a step back and say that we shouldn't think, if people that haven't been to these areas in Western China, that there's no integration, that the people aren't friends sometimes, relatives sometimes. Xining was a relatively integrated city. A lot of that changed in 2008, from what I could see, when there was these ethnic riots or uprisings, I may say. So I don't want to suggest otherwise. There's complete separation or something like this, but I don't think that Tibetans and some others have been well integrated into the entire, into the national community, as we point out. Why that is, in comparison to the Soviet Union, it's hard for me to say. Clearly, I think that there was probably less attempt at, there was less power given to Tibetans and others, I think, in China than there were to at least minority, quote unquote, minority elites in the Soviet Union, for one. I think there was less ability to plod their own economic and political and cultural path. Now, I don't want to overstate that in the Soviet Union, of course, right? There are restrictions there as well. But I think there's been very, very little in China from basically day one. So even in Qinghai province during the United Front period, the leadership was all Chinese, with one major exception, or two major exceptions. But one of them had no real political power, for instance, and maybe the other one didn't either. So I think that might be the core of it. There really was never even really the inkling of giving genuine limited political power to most ethnic minorities. I think Bulag talks about Ulanhu in Inner Mongolia being the primary exception. I'm not sure there's many others.
Thank you very much. And I think Tashi wants to say a last word from Tibet GovLab.
I do. I just want to say, Benno, thank you so much for bringing your book and this conversation here today. Although, because of video conferencing, suddenly we're a global event. It's really funny because usually we have our GW events at the Seeger Center and through these different programs, and they're small and intimate, and we have no idea the extent of the audience, but I know that this is such a worthy book to look at, and I hope people will be studying. Can I just say that what this accomplishes, what this shows us, is that this conversation cannot even properly get started in this short of a time. There's many things that have been discussed. I think there are many questions that people have in their minds right now. And can I just say that as we develop new work that really tries to address the ongoing state building, nation building processes that there are in China, that we're also seeing all of this in the historical context in light of everything else, the world historical changes in political ideology that was also going on at the turn of the 20th century. So when we're rooting around thinking who thinks that they're Chinese, who thinks that they're Tibetan, etc., Uyghur, we have to realize that even the framework of a nation state was so very new. It was new for Germany, it was new for Italy, it was new for everyone, and everyone was rushing to become something, right? So just to have that in mind as we kind of hopefully create more space to really be creative now as well. So thank you for being here, Benno.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
And although our webinar draws to a close, there will be a recording of the event as well as purchase links for Benno's book. And the giveaway winner will be sent out next week as well. I want to thank everybody for attending, and just to give a plug, on October 22nd, we're going to be doing a very similar event about Xinjiang, and we're going to be discussing primarily my book, but also with Eric Schussel, who also has a wonderful new book out about Xinjiang. So hope to see you then, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you very much.